Midtown. This is Matt Tollander with our third and our final video on inductive Bible study. If you haven't watched the first two videos, you can go back in our Instagram feed and find them. Just look for the tiles that have a giant picture of my head, and they should be easy to find. And in the first video, we covered the first step of inductive Bible study, which is observation. During the observation phase, we're asking the question, what does it say? What does the text say? And the purpose of the observation phase is to gather data about the text, and then in the next phase, the interpretation phase, we synthesize that data into an interpretation by asking the question, what does the text mean? And once we've synthesized our observations about the text into an interpretation, we are ready to move forward into the application phase. And in the application phase, we're asking the question, what does the text require of me? Now, back in our interpretation phase, in phase 2, one of the things we had to figure out about our text is whether the text is descriptive or prescriptive. Is this text trying to just tell me about what happened, tell me about how things were, or is the intention of the writer in this text to give me some sort of instruction about how to live my life, how to think, how to speak, how to act, and those sorts of things? Not every text is equally applicable. And so part of the interpretation phase is figuring out, will the applications of this text be very tangible sort of applications, or will they be more about just understanding more about God, or understanding more about the story? And then additionally, not all applications in a text are explicit. Some of them are implicit applications. A good example of explicit application text would be like the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are pretty clear, very easy to understand, and it's easy to follow. Thou shalt not lie. Very easy to understand, very easy to apply. The application is explicit. But for other texts, the application is implicit and requires a little bit of digging. And so what I want to do in this video is just work with one very short text from the Sermon on the Mount and try and show you what it looks like when a text has an implicit application. So this little bit, it's 3 verses from the Sermon on the Mount, and it'll be very familiar to everyone, even if you didn't grow up in church. This is a very popular teaching of Jesus. So Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 3, and I'm going to go until verse 5. Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So during my observation phase, I would have gathered data on this verse. I would have, for example, I would have noted that this is an illustration. So Jesus is speaking hypothetically. He's speaking to make a point. He's not literally talking about someone who has a speck or a log in their eye. It's pretty clear that he's being ironic. The main source of that irony, I would note this during my observation phase, is the disparity in size between the speck and the log. So the irony is that the speck is very small, the log is very large. And I'm going to notice the key word in verse 5 where Jesus says, you hypocrite. And so Jesus, this little bunch of verses here seems to be, it involves Jesus' condemnation of what he calls a hypocrite. And so that means I need to investigate that word hypocrite. And during my interpretation phase, I would try and probably look at the Greek for this word and see if the original Greek word means the same thing as our English word hypocrite, or whether there's a more nuanced sort of way to understand it. And in doing so, I would have found out the Greek word hypokritos is where we get our English word hypocrite, but it doesn't mean exactly the same thing. We use our English word hypocrite to mean someone who says one thing and does another, perhaps someone who's deceitful in doing that. The word hypokritos at this time meant an actor, someone who wore a mask. In other words, the superficial reality doesn't match the internal reality, is what it means to be a hypocrite. And Jesus is going to criticize the Pharisees using that same word later on in the book of Matthew. So even in the same book in which I'm working, I have other places where I can go to investigate the meaning of this passage. And as I'm working through interpreting these 3 verses, say I'm starting to think maybe the point of these verses is not just the way they're always taught, which is that you shouldn't pick at specks in other people's eyes because you have enough of your own business to worry about, which may be well and true, but I don't think that's exactly the point that Jesus is trying to make. So in my interpretation phase, I would have gone back through the Sermon on the Mount, and I would have tried to see, is this a theme? Is this related to any of the themes that Jesus is carrying through this sermon? And in doing so, looking at the context, I would have noticed that the verses right before the passage that we're looking at in this video say this: "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the same way you judge, you will be judged." Okay? And then if we flip all the way back to chapter 5, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this: "I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' will be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." So Jesus connects this idea of judging and labeling someone to murder in chapter 5 at the very beginning of the sermon. What point is Jesus trying to make? Well, at the beginning of the sermon, he makes the point that if you label someone, he uses the word fool, but you could pick whatever word means fool, in your vocabulary. If you label someone, then what you've done is you've simplified them so that you don't have to deal with them as a complex human being. So if I can simplify someone as a fool, I can give myself permission to dismiss them and not have to acknowledge their full humanity. And Jesus says that is spiritually, it's similar to murder. Because if I've done that to someone, labeled and dismissed them, it's like I've killed them because they're dead to me anyway. So understanding that this is a theme that Jesus is sort of carrying through the Sermon on the Mount, I will come back to our 3 verses about the log and the speck. And I'll notice in verse 5 where Jesus says this: "First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So Jesus' concern in this little illustration about the log and the speck is not that the person with the log is trying to help someone else with their speck. His concern is about the attitude with which the person trying to do the help is approaching the person with the speck. And Jesus says if you try to help somebody with an issue while maintaining a judgmental attitude toward them, then it's not going to work. You're probably just going to hurt them. You're probably not going to be able to help them. In fact, Jesus would say the problem is that you can't even see the person who you're trying to help because you already have judgment. And that's the point of the log. If you have a log in your eye, you can't see out of it. So, okay, if the timeless principle here is that in dealing with other people, I have to reserve judgment. Otherwise, I'm not going to be helpful to anybody, and I won't be a positive presence in someone's life. Then the way that I would work this application out, because I've arrived at it, it's an implicit application. The way I work this out is to think and reflect about the ways that it's relevant to my life right now. And the way that I would do that is by asking questions that actually point backward and forward. And this is not the one right way to do it. This is just an exercise that I do. Is when I come to the application point, when I'm working through a text and I've derived a timeless principle, what I want to do is I want to look back in my life and see if there's anything I can remember from my experience or from the experience of people I know. Is there anything I can remember that validates the principle that I've derived from the text? Is there anything, can I see how this has played itself out? Can I see how the people who have lived according to this principle have benefited? Have I seen the way how people who ignore this principle have been harmed or have not benefited because of that? And I want to look to my own life. Okay, when I have lived this way, what have the consequences been? Or when I failed to live this way, what sort of consequences were there? So I want to look to the past and look to my own experience to see, how does my own experience confirm the truth of what I've arrived at here in studying the scripture? And then I also want to look toward the future. And I want to ask, if I reorganized my life and rearranged my life in such a way that I was going to be living in accordance with this principle, what would the impact be? How would it change my life? How would it change the lives of people around me? Would it benefit me? Would it benefit those people? Or what is the danger in ignoring this? So I've been confronted with something from Scripture, and I want to obey it. And so one of the things that goes into thinking that through is just thinking about, okay, what are the negative consequences if I don't? What will happen if I ignore this? And this, I think, is Jesus. These are Jesus' own applicational questions, because he is going to say this at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, starting in verse 24. He says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them." So it's not just hearing; it's also application. It's also obeying. And in the Jewish understanding, to hear and not obey is not to hear at all. So Jesus says, "And everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them, does not obey, will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell with a great crash." So even at the end of his most important teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus ends with an illustration of, here's what happens if you hear these words of mine and obey, and here's what will happen if you don't obey. And so when I look to answer this application question of what does the text require of me, I also want to ask the question, what will be the reward or the positive consequence of faithfulness in this area of obedience? And then also, what will be the negative consequence? What could be the harm that could come to me if I don't put this into practice? Because that's the way that Jesus frames observation in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's our third video. Inductive Bible study is 3 steps: observation. What does the text say? Interpretation. What does the text mean? And then application. What does the text require of me? And as you make a habit out of engaging Scripture this way, you will become more confident as you read it. You will become. It will become easier for you the more you do this, and you'll find that you can take this exercise as deep as you want to take it. You can do this exercise in the span of 20 to 30 minutes. You can do this exercise over hours. I love it because it's such a really versatile method of engaging with Scripture, and I hope it helps you as well.